Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. As Elisa said, I work for Translations Online, which is a Prague-based media development NGO. And what we do, we do all sorts of trainings. We do a couple of projects where we try to promote new media in the countries of the former Soviet bloc. But I also follow a bit what's happening outside of the region in places like Africa, the Middle East, and North America. So I'll try to give you my perspective, not just on the blogosphere, but on the web as a whole. What's happening, how the users are different, how the needs are different, and whether there can be some sort of dialogue, let's say, between the East and the West, and what would be the areas in which it can happen. So I think I'm going to talk for around 15-20 minutes, and then I would be happy to take any questions or have some sort of discussion if you're willing to take part in it. So let me start from this provocative site. I don't know how many of you have seen it. There was a map of social networks released a couple of months ago, which basically showed you how various countries are using particular social networks, right? So you could see, and those are the dominant networks in each country. And I don't know if the light is good enough for you to see that many countries are using many networks, which means that I'm mostly talking to each other rather than internationally cross-border. So you have people, for example, on LiveJournal in the former USSR who are just talking to people on LiveJournal. And in 99% of the cases, those people come from the same background, the same country, the same environment. You get the same more or less on Facebook, you know, where you would mostly interact if you're in the US with other people who are from the US. You have the classical case of Orkut in Brazil, which is now a Google-owned social network, where you get people who are from Brazil interacting mostly from people in Brazil. And you also got, I think, around 4% of Indians on Orkut, right? So a lot of this interaction is actually between people from one country rather than cross-border. And I'm sure, of course, there are examples and there are exceptions to this rule. But I think it would be generally true to say that a lot of this is pure national communication rather than transnational. And this slide I show often in my presentations. It comes from the summer's issue of Discover magazine. And they asked one of the leading specialists in visualization techniques basically to track the one-way and reciprocal links between various blogs and sites on the blogosphere. And what he did, he mapped the relations, but he also pointed us to a few sites. And showed us where they fit. And to me, I mean, sure, you can see daily cost, Boeing, you know, and everything else. A particularly worrying trend to me is number 3, which you can see on the very margin of this map, which is LiveJournal, which as many of you would know, which is a leading platform in the former USSR, for example, right? What it means is that this is, I mean, you can see that it's quite a significant, you know, chunk. It is a big chunk, but it's a chunk which is talking to itself, right? So there are very few outgoing or ingoing links from and to this particular service, right? And I'm sure that if we go ahead and, for example, try to map Orkut, you would see a picture of almost the same sort of meaning, right? It would be somewhere on the margins. Let's look at Wikipedia, for example, right? We all know that Wikipedia exists in many languages, some of which are not even spoken anymore by anybody, right? But we still see that the Western European languages, or you know, the classical Western languages, still dominate the first 10 positions, or you know, the languages of the developed countries, if you want to put it that way, because you have Japanese on the list, and you have English, which I think this data is from June, July 2007. And now Wikipedia, in English language at least, has passed the 2 million mark, right? So you have around 2 million articles in English. And if you look at all other languages, it's significantly less, right? So if you look at the nearest sort of developing world language, if you look at Russian, it's place 11, and Chinese place 12. So you have almost 20 times less articles, few articles in Chinese than you get in English. right? So it just shows you what language we speak on the internet, which you pretty much already know, but it also shows you that the predominant language and the predominant view on events on the web is still English, and it's driven by English language environment consideration. One of my favorite funny sites is something called Wiki groaning. I don't know how many of you have heard of it. What it allows you to do is basically to to compare two terms, right? So you can put in, Britney Spears and, Christina Aguilera. You can put, Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden and see how much text they exist in Wikipedia about it, right? So it basically shows you how much content has been created on a particular topic, right? And to me, I do these experiments quite often. So, I just decided to compare, Pokemon, the favorite, sort of cartoon and comic character, and a bunch of characters, and Václav Havel, the dissident leader of the Czech Republic. And sure, Pokemon wins on Wikipedia, right? Why? Because it's predominantly driven by people for whom Pokemon is more important than Václav Havel. It's a very provocative thesis, but the further you look, the more occurrences like this you see. You see the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the amount of content available about it on Wikipedia is pretty much the same. Actually, it's even more than the content about Tiananmen Square massacre in China, right? And you can play such experiments and see how much stuff they exist on Wikipedia, which is not necessarily driven or created by people who care about Tiananmen Square, right? So my thesis, when I look at such graphs and such comparisons, is that people who really care about the Tiananmen Square of Václav Havel are not yet necessarily active users of Wikipedia or not necessarily active users of Web 2.0, right? So that brings us to the question of storytelling. Right? And those are two very interesting pictures. The first picture was taken a few months ago. There was a big steam explosion in New York City around July, I think. And a lot of passerbys were stopping and taking pictures with their mobile phones, taking pictures with their cameras, trying to record the experience, right? And that was a big story in New York. Everybody was really passionate about, being a citizen journalism and recording it. The second picture comes from Africa, and those two guys are using a particular product called Cyber Tracker. What it basically allows you to do, it allows you to map your environment. So they can actually, it has an interface like this, a user interface like this. So, for people who, and sure, most of them are illiterate, right? So they cannot read. And they want people who help them to set this up, they want to map and have a better understanding of the environment in which those tribes live, right? So they hand them out those tools, which have GPS, which have, all sorts of other communication gadgets. And they can actually, press the button for an animal they see, or they can press the button for the activity which is happening around them, right? So in that way, those people are trying to map the world around this particular tribe, right? So the question is, what do we need more? Do we need another picture of the steam explosion in New York, where we already have 5,000, or should we rather care about giving a voice to people who have not had the chance to speak up just because they were lacking access to technology? And that's a question which I often ask myself, and that's a question which I believe Web 2.0 helps us to solve, or technology in general helps us to solve. There was a similar experiment done in India by Swansea University in Britain, where they were handing out mobile phones and cameras to a particular village in India so that people can record whatever is happening around them. But also, they were installing screens which were documenting all those stories, so the younger generations could actually go and press the buttons and see whatever is happening in the village, right? So those are the new ways of recording the life story of your community, right? And this is, to a large extent, what Wikipedia is all about. We are documenting stories which are important to us. Right now, it seems like Wikipedia is predominantly populated by people who care about Pokemon, or who care about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's why so much content there is driven by their interest rather than interest of these guys